hustings. Who will become the next Prime Minister? Will it be Rishi Sunak or will it be Liz Truss? The legend that is Alistair Stewart will be asking probing questions of these candidates, but also Conservative Party members from this region, from the northwest, will be coming here as well, and it will be quite the spectacle. As you can see, we are preparing currently. The work is going underway, and we'll be exploring exactly what's coming up on this programme. We'll be exploring what's coming up on those hustings. We'll be talking about the hustings, we'll be talking about the state of the race, but we'll also be talking about some other large political issues too. Catch it all after the headlines.
Tom, thank you. Good afternoon. It's 1 minute past 12. I'm Bethany Elsey, here to bring you up to date from the GB newsroom. NHS leaders are warning the UK faces a humanitarian crisis this winter unless further action is taken to tackle rising energy bills. In a letter to the government, the NHS Confederation says people will have to choose whether to skip meals to heat their homes or live in cold, damp conditions. It warns this could lead to an increase in annual deaths and create further pressure on the health service. The government previously announced £400 of support for millions of households, but won't do anything further until the Prime Minister is in office. More travel disruption today as Transport for London workers strike in a long-running dispute over jobs and pensions. Commuters are being advised to avoid the tube, which will have little or no services running. Most buses across West and South West London are also cancelled. Mainline services across the UK have also been affected this morning due to yesterday's strike, and there's further action planned for tomorrow. Transport Secretary Grant Shapps claims union bosses are getting in the way of a deal.
I think the simple answer to this would be for the union bosses to actually put the deal that's on the table, which is an 8% pay rise over 2 years, no compulsory redundancies, for example, on Network Rail, and put that to their membership. And I think if they did that, the membership may well accept it. If that doesn't happen, plan B, if you like, is we're going to make sure that we actually get on with these very, very important modernisations, which are holding our railway back.
Well, Labour's Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, says it's the government that's hindering negotiations.
What I'd say to the RMT is the primary motivator for you going on strike today is your concerns about conditions the government may attach to a funding deal with a TfL. We're on the same side here. Nobody wants the government to be touching unreasonable conditions to our deal. The only reason we need a deal is because of the pandemic. Let's work together with businesses, with other Londoners, to get the best possible deal for London. Today, it's ordinary Londoners, it's commuters, it's businesses who are caught in the crossfire. The government, Grant Shapps, isn't affected at all.
UK retail sales increased in July, but experts say a downward trend in consumer spending shows no sign of turning around. The Office for National Statistics says the 0.3% rise in July is significantly higher than expectations of a 0.2% drop, but sales fell by 1.2% in the 3 months prior. The government has borrowed more money than expected, with interest payments on debt rising by more than 40% last month. The ONS says government borrowing hit £4.9 billion in July. That's £2 billion higher than predicted. Both candidates for Prime Minister have pledged further assistance for households amid the rising cost of living, but the higher than expected figures put pressure on funds available to the government. A 44-year-old man has appeared at Willesden Magistrates Court charged with the murder of 87-year-old Thomas O'Halloran. Lee Byer is accused of stabbing Mr O'Halloran to death while he was riding his mobility scooter in the town of Greenford on Tuesday. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Mr Byer was remanded in custody and will appear at the Old Bailey later this month. And a man has been arrested following the abduction and sexual assault of a 6-year-old girl in Greater Manchester on Wednesday. The 23-year-old remains in custody for questioning. A 35-year-old man arrested on Wednesday has been released without further action. Police say the girl was attacked in the area of Droylsden and she's now back safely with her family. Extremely hot and dry conditions in Europe are causing wildfires to sweep across parts of the continent. In Spain, more than 400 firefighters and 36 aircraft are tackling the blaze in Valencia, which has ravaged 19,000 hectares. The fire has been burning for days. It was dampened by rain on Wednesday, but raged again overnight by strong winds. Over 1,000 people have been forced to evacuate their homes in nearby villages. And self-driving, fully autonomous vehicles could be on UK motorways in the next 3 years under new government plans. The Department for Transport says £100 million is being invested into the scheme, along with new legislation. The government claims the self-driving industry could create up to 38,000 jobs and make roads safer. This is GB News. We're bringing more news as it happens. Now let's get back to Tom.
A very good afternoon to you. It's 6 minutes past 12 and this is The Briefing with me, Tom Harwood, live on your televisions and your radios. I'm standing here in Manchester today. Why? Well, for one very simple reason. GB News is honoured to be hosting the latest in the Conservative leadership hustings this afternoon. This evening from 7 p.m. until 9 p.m. you'll be able to tune in exclusively to GB News to hear the very latest from what Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss have to say, the two people who in just 2 weeks' time want to become your Prime Minister. Well, it's interesting to bring this race to the Northwest. The Northwest is a region of the United Kingdom with a strong local identity. And one of the big questions that will be being asked this evening is just how much more specific will the pitch be to the other various areas of the country? Well, I'm delighted to be joined now live here in our studio by Sophie Reaper. She's the GB News Northwest of England correspondent. And I suppose the first question is, I know you've been speaking to individuals in this area today. What do they make of the race?
Well, actually, it was really interesting because if I'm being brutally honest, most people said they don't want either Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss to take over as the new Prime Minister. Those people who did answer, of course, we did get a few people saying one way or the other, but I think it was summarised by one gentleman who said he thought Rishi Sunak would do the best job, but he just didn't know if he could trust him. So it'll be really interesting this evening to hear what the candidates have to say to try and garner that trust from the people they'll be speaking to in this region.
Well, let's have a listen to what some of those people you were speaking to a little bit earlier had to say.
Helping people with low income and putting some money or something on for them.
I think that they should be looking to do something about the energy bill crisis that we've got going on. The cost of living is just going to spiral out of control. I think people are already struggling.
I don't care whoever it is, as long as they, do something, Action is, speaks louder than words,
Tories need to be out, but also Keir Starmer needs to not be pretending to be Labour when he's absolutely not. We need to stop trying to privatise everything.
I don't think Sunak comes from a working class background. He doesn't know what it's like to live a standard life.
Make it better, take care of the people. More recreation and the children and the streets. Homeless people, help homeless people.
It's Labour, it's got to be. This is a working city. Everybody works, everybody struggles, but ain't no one helping Manchester out.
The new Prime Minister needs to focus on the levelling up of the UK. I think the public transport up here is shocking compared to London. They keep on saying that they're going to do more to help Manchester, but they're really not.
The one that's probably going to do the better job is probably Rishi Sunak. However, I wouldn't necessarily prefer Rishi Sunak. I'm not sure I trust him.
A lot of people are struggling. They are well dressed with a gold chain, but mentally they are going through a lot. And I don't think government is doing enough.
If I was Prime Minister for the day, the first thing I would do would get them all in and I'd say, right, there's no more expenses being paid and I want you to take a pay cut. And whoever was left, they're the true ones, aren't they? They're the ones that will help you lead the country. We want a strong person.
And that's neither of them?
No. They've got no bottle, darling.
Better wages, better schemes for single parents.
Increase the minimum wage to help the people that are really struggling, which is lots. I work in a hospital and we've got nurses that are using food banks. Should never be happening.
Tax cuts is a load of nonsense because at the end of the day, we're a society.
Some members of the public speaking in Manchester a little bit earlier on. Well, let's return now to Sophie, because I suppose a big distinction in this race is that, yes, everyone has a stake in this. This will be the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. But it's not everyone who gets a vote. They're really making a pitch to Conservative Party members.
Yeah, and that's what's going to be really interesting, because for anyone watching who isn't a Conservative Party member, those that I spoke to talked about the really big issues like the cost of living crisis or levelling up here in the north. But of course, as you say, that's not necessarily what they'll be pitching to, because it's not the average person who will be voting on the new Prime Minister.
Yeah, and I suppose when we're looking at what people in the region want versus what people who are party members in the region want, do you sense there might be a distinction there?
Yeah, I think there is, because, as I say, these big issues such as the cost of living crisis, you mentioned the strong identity here in the northwest, and I think, you know, here in Manchester especially, people think of themselves. There was one gentleman in that clip that we just saw who talked about Manchester and it being working class, and that's the kind of mood throughout. So when they speak to people in the northwest, that's very different to people who are going to be voting on who the next Prime Minister will be.
Really interesting stuff there. Well, Sophie, thank you for bringing us that, and of course those vox pops, the voices of the people of Manchester. Really interesting stuff there. Well, let's have a listen to someone who is potentially more weighty in this contest than the average punter on the street. Potentially that's not such a good thing in this contest, but of course it is an elite race, and one of the people backing one of those contenders in this race is former Health Secretary Matt Hancock. Now, one of the things about this race over the last few weeks is it's said that Liz Truss has a very weighty lead ahead of Rishi Sunak. The latest YouGov poll put her more than 30 points ahead. However, Mr. Hancock, who of course is backing Rishi Sunak, started to say that earlier today he believes the race might be a little bit closer.
I think talking to party members, the contest is wide open. If you look at the polling, you could take that with a pinch of salt. It's very hard to poll Conservative Party members. And in fact, the latest polls show that the gap is closing. So, you know, that reflects my experience. Rishi at these hustings is going down very well. And you get more people supporting him on the way out than on the way in. So everybody who's a member of the Conservative Party, you know, needs a chance to vote. We've had a 6-week contest. And I think, you know, Rishi is the man to tackle the sorts of problems that we heard from the people of Manchester just there. He's absolutely ready. Look, I sat next to him, worked very hard with him during the pandemic, which was an enormous crisis. And there he kept people in jobs. Everybody thought there was going to be a huge unemployment crisis. That's one crisis we don't have at the moment because of his furlough scheme. So, you know, he's probably seen more experience than any other candidate standing to be Prime Minister. And that's testament to his experience and what he's done with it, which has been very radical in the past, to keep businesses going, to keep people in jobs. And now we need that same sort of approach, targeted support for people with energy bills, but also getting inflation down overall. Because, you know, without doing that, we're really stuffed.
Former Health Secretary Matt Hancock speaking on GB News a little bit earlier today. But what else is being made of this contest? Of course, there are many people who have declared for candidates, but some individuals are still yet to make up their minds. One such individual here in Greater Manchester is Councillor Robin Garrido, who joins me now. He's the leader of the Conservative opposition group on Salford City Council. And Robin, what are you looking for later today? Could this evening's event help you make up your mind?
Yes, it could. I'm looking for more positive comments, certainly regarding levelling up, That's really important to us in the north. Conservative government so far has given a considerable amount of money towards levelling up, led by Boris Johnson, and we want to see that continued and increased. So that's one thing. The other thing we're really concerned about is obviously the economy is top of the agenda. I want to know how each candidate is actually going to pay for what they're suggesting. So whether it be Rishi Sunak or Liz Truss, there is payment at the end of the day. I want to know how that's going to be dealt with, who's going to be responsible for that, and is it going to be lay at the feet of our children and grandchildren. And then lots of other issues, of course, but very important to the people in the north, particularly in places like Salford. We have a limited amount of green belt. I'm very concerned, in fact, that we retain that green belt and that we get the support from either of those two candidates to enable us to do that. There's a big fight going on at the moment in Worsley, Booth Town and in Earlham.
So one of your big views is to try and make sure that there isn't so much development in the local area, or just that development should be in different places than where it's proposed?
Yeah, I mean, we believe, in fact, that we ought to develop far more on brownfield sites rather than greenfield sites. Greenfield sites add to the quality of life for local residents. And when you live in an urban area like Salford, it's very important that you've got open spaces that people can breathe some fresh air, have a walk and so on. Within a few minutes of maybe a very built-up area, which we have in Salford.
Now, you're someone who voted Remain in the European Union referendum several years ago, and you've got an interesting dilemma there in that case, because of course Rishi Sunak in this race was the original Brexiteer. He voted to leave, but he's getting more support from people who voted Remain according to the polls, and it's completely vice versa when it comes to Liz Truss. What are you going to be listening for on the Brexit issue?
Right, well, I think as far as Rishi Sunak's concerned, yes, I am concerned that he was obviously Brexiteer. But I rather feel, in fact, that as he's extremely prudent on the economy, in my opinion, that we may well start to hear some voices of support for certain involvement with Europe. So I don't think you can rule that out, and I'd like each candidate to consider at least having some partnership agreement with Europe to help us through this difficult economic situation. I think the inflation that we're now starting to see is partly caused, not wholly, but partly caused by us leaving Europe.
Interesting stuff there. And just finally, the difference between what Conservative members might be thinking versus what people in the wider country are thinking. Do you think this race is focused too closely, too keenly on 160, 180,000 people compared to the entire country?
No, I don't, because what you've got to accept, in fact, is that the Conservative Party covers a very wide area. My own ward, in fact, in Worsley, in Westwood Park, comprises of a large social housing area, adjacent immediately to £1 million plus houses, and I represent both sides of that community. So I think I know what the average person is looking for, and I think there are many Conservatives who also are average Conservative voters as well as Conservative members.
Well, Councillor Robin Garrido, really appreciate your time here, and we'll catch up with you after the event this evening to see if what these candidates say tonight might change your mind. Thanks for joining us. Thank you. Well, now moving on to another story today, of course, because this week saw the horrific killing of a local man in London, an 88-year-old who was well known to his local community, who raised money for the defence of Ukraine. Thomas O'Halloran was a staple of his community, and now a man has been charged with his killing. Let's cross over to our Home Affairs and Security correspondent Mark White, who has more.
Yes, this is 44-year-old Lee Byer, who appeared in the dock here at Willesden Magistrates Court. He spoke only to confirm his name, his date of birth, and the fact that he had no fixed address. He was arrested at a house in Southall in West London in the early hours of yesterday morning by armed police. Now, that followed an appeal that the Metropolitan Police had made, where CCTV images were released of a man running away from the scene of this stabbing. It happened on Tuesday afternoon, 4 o'clock in the afternoon, in fact, in broad daylight, as Thomas O'Halloran was on his mobility scooter heading down Western Avenue next to the busy A40 road into central London. The court heard that he'd suffered a fatal stab wound to the chest. Despite that, he managed to continue on in his mobility scooter for some 75 metres until he came across members of the public and asked for help. Now, despite the efforts of paramedics and the London Air Ambulance Service, the 87-year-old was pronounced dead at the scene just nearby to where he had been stabbed. Now, this 44-year-old man, Lee Byer, has been remanded back into custody. He'll appear again, this time at the Central Criminal Court, the Old Bailey, next Tuesday, the 23rd of August. And in addition to facing one count of murder, he also faces a charge of the possession of an offensive weapon, namely a knife.
Really harrowing stuff, Mark. Well, we'll be following this case as it goes on. We shouldn't let it slip down the running order, as of course we shouldn't get desensitised to these horrific acts of violence within our very own capital city. Well, thanks to Mark for that. We've got a jam-packed show coming up for you. After the break, we'll be exploring more on the economy, on defence, and on so much more. Stick with us.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to the programme. My name's Tom Harwood and you're watching The Briefing here in Manchester. Yes, we're on location today because later on this evening, GB News will be exclusively broadcasting the latest Conservative Party hustings, the battle between Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, hosted by the legend that is Alastair Stewart. But in the run-up to that battle, we're exploring all the different angles of this race, what it means for the Conservative Party, what it means for the country, and what it means for our politics in general. So I'm delighted to now be joined by Graham Stringer, the Labour MP, not so far from here, who, of course, has been following the developments, the twists and turns in this race. And Graham Stringer, just from your perspective, as an opposition member of Parliament, what's your view of the race so far? And does it feel like it's dragged on a little too far?
I can certainly agree with that. I think since the Conservatives reduced it to two candidates,
I think it's under 4 weeks ago. It seems more like 4 months that they've been debating. It's been too long. The country's in a state of limbo. There are huge problems to be faced, and the government's gone to sleep. So that's very worrying, as well as it being a long process. Watching it as a disinterested, in one sense, a disinterested party, I think, let's put it politely, that neither of the candidates have shown themselves to be statespeople. They've been appealing to the sort of lower prejudice of Conservative Party members and not dealing with the huge issues that face this country. All over the public services, we can see they're in a state of crisis. Inflation is increasing. There's a war going on in Europe, and these candidates are appealing to the prejudices. They've both made statements that were anti-North. Rishi Sunak went to Kent and said he ensured that the affluent parts of Kent got more money than the poorer parts of the north of England. Liz Truss has said that one of the reasons that the country's productivity was low because workers in the north of England were lazy. I mean, that is not what one expects from, because one of these people will be Prime Minister in 3 weeks or so. That's really low-level politics.
Now, of course, both of those campaign teams might deny those claims, although potentially support it against each other, if you see what I mean. Has this race become a gift to the Labour Party, in your view? The way that these two camps have been tearing scraps out of each other, Rishi Sunak calling Liz Truss immoral, for example. Has the temperature reached the extent to which the Labour Party is actually quite enjoying this?
I wouldn't say enjoying it, but I think the number of quotes that have been from these two candidates and the other candidates at the start of this race have saved me the trouble of having to write my election address when the general election is finally called. You can see that there are deep divisions within the Conservative Party. A lot of the people individually intensely dislike each other. At one level, I knew that from discussions in the House of Commons, but it has come out into the open air, and it is going to make fighting the next general election a lot easier. There are a lot of quotes that are a gift to any Labour candidate. But I really go back to my original point, that one expects better. They're attacking and biting pieces out of each other when they really should be telling us what they're going to do about the National Health Service, what they're going to do about the public transport system, what they're going to do about the economy, what they're going to do about the levels of crime. And they're not really addressing those issues. And I think one of the reasons is they're also denying that many of the problems we've got have been caused by the pair of them who've been in the cabinet for a long time, and they're denying their responsibility for many of the problems that we've got. The parlous state of transport, inflation itself, while some of it is coming from the war in Ukraine, one can't deny that. Some is also coming from, they took their eye off the ball, allowed quantitative easing to carry on for much too long, which has caused inflation on the asset side of the economy. And they're not talking about their own responsibilities for spending too much money. You just had Matt Hancock on as the Secretary of State for Health during COVID, where he wasted on test and trace and other areas more than £100 billion. How useful would that be at the moment? So they're not addressing their own responsibilities. They're not addressing the problems that the country is facing.
Well, there's a lot to unpick there. Some would suggest that the testing system that was rolled out in this country might have been worth the money during COVID. Others might say that quantitative easing is more of an operationally independent matter of the Bank of England. Really interesting areas all there. But I think let's finally end this conversation on the question of why is Sir Keir Starmer not doing so well? Given what you say may well be true, given that the Conservative Party is tearing chunks out of each other, given the gifts that are given to the Labour Party right now, polls this week suggesting that in a head-to-head, Liz Truss is polling ahead of Sir Keir Starmer.
Just going back to the first point, the National Auditor's Office have said that the government wasted billions and billions on test and trace. Those aren't my words. On the Labour Party is ahead in the opinion polls at the moment. You can always go to popularity polls on individuals. I wish Keir was doing better than he is doing in terms of the personal popularity stakes, but the Labour Party is well ahead. That's the important poll on this. I think Keir needs to change. When he was dealing with Boris Johnson as Prime Minister, being slightly staid was an advantage against the boisterousness and the sort of fantasies that the then Prime Minister was using. I think it's not good enough at the moment just to watch the Conservative Party opera where they are, as you say, tearing pieces out of each other. We have to be very clear on what our policies are and what our remedies are, and we need to be saying that morning, noon and night. And I think you make a fair point. We are not as energetic in pursuing those policies at the moment as we should be.
Really interesting stuff there. Well, thank you so much for your time, Graham Stringer. Really interesting to talk through those points with you. Well, after the bulletins and indeed the break, we'll be back discussing the transport strikes affecting the country this weekend and indeed the situation in Ukraine as well. Don't go anywhere.
Hello there, good afternoon. You're watching GB News. I'm Bethany Elsey here to bring you up to date at 32 minutes past 12. NHS leaders are warning the UK faces a humanitarian crisis this winter unless further action is taken to tackle rising energy bills. In a letter to the government, the NHS Confederation says surging costs could mean people won't be able to afford to heat their homes, potentially leading to an increase in annual deaths and creating further pressure on the health service. The government has promised £400 of support for millions of households, but won't do anything further until the new Prime Minister is in office. A 44-year-old man has appeared at Willesden Magistrates Court charged with the murder of 87-year-old Thomas O'Halloran. Lee Byer is accused of stabbing Mr O'Halloran to death while he was riding his mobility scooter in the town of Greenford on Tuesday. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Mr Byer was remanded in custody and will appear at the Old Bailey later this month. A man who killed his wife on their wedding night and put her body in a suitcase has been given a life sentence with a minimum term of 21 years. Thomas Nutt killed his partner, Dawn Walker, and dumped the suitcase in bushes behind their home near Halifax in West Yorkshire last year. Miss Walker's body was found 4 days later. And self-driving, fully autonomous vehicles could be on UK motorways in the next 3 years. The Department for Transport says £100 million is being invested into the scheme, along with new legislation. The government claims the self-driving industry could create up to 38,000 jobs and make roads safer. On TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News. We'll get back to the briefing and Tom in just a moment.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. Over a drink, we have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back. It's 12:36. My name's Tom Harwood, and this is The Briefing, live from the centre of Manchester. Well, let's get on to our next story today, because the economy is the underlying theme that has really rocked the country over the last few weeks. Inflation very high, energy bills skyrocketing, taxes at a 70-year high. Where do we go from here? Well, let's speak now to the independent economist Julian Jessup, who has been poring over all sorts of numbers this week, particularly with regard to a report from the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Now, this report has been leapt on by all of the camps and interested parties in this leadership race, because it makes the national finances look in a pretty bad state. Indeed, Rishi Sunak's team is saying that this report means that potentially large tax cuts would be unaffordable. Julian, do you agree?
Well, I don't. I must say I'm a big fan of the IFS, but what they've done here is basically an exercise in number crunching rather than a serious piece of economics. And I've really got no fewer than 4 problems with it. First of all, it takes the grim economic outlook as a given. Whereas in practice, I think most of us recognise that tax cuts would help, including in terms of boosting growth and potentially lowering inflation as well. The second point is that they make a lot about the big potential increase in debt interest payments as a result of higher inflation. But those additional payments will be spread over many years. It's rather hard to see why they're a constraint on tax cuts now. The third point I'd make is that even if borrowing does go up a bit, frankly, so what? We're in the midst of a major economic crisis when people are really struggling to pay their bills. And, if tax cuts can be part of the solution to that, then go for it. And the final point is that if we're really worried about the sustainability of the public finances, we shouldn't worry about borrowing from year to year. What we should look at is the stock of debt relative to the size of the economy. And that's still likely to fall, and perhaps even fall further if the economy is bigger in cash terms because inflation is higher. So overall, I see where the IFS is coming from, but I do hope it doesn't guide policy for whoever the next Prime Minister may be.
So to some extent, if there can be targeted tax cuts or indeed supply-side reforms that grow the economy, the quantity of debt relative to the size of the economy will actually be coming down, and that would make the country on a fairly better footing when it comes to being attractive to investors abroad and the like.
Well, that's absolutely right. Or perhaps another way of looking at it is that inflation is both bad and good for the public finances. It's bad on the spending side, including higher debt interest payments, but it's actually good on the revenue side because it boosts the amount of money that the Treasury gets from taxes on income and profits and on prices. So if you take those two things in the round, inflation actually is neutral or maybe even positive for the public finances. At the very least, I think it sort of creates more room for the Chancellor to give back some of the extraordinary amounts of extra money he's got from tax revenues that he wasn't anticipating. I think that's not only just the economically efficient thing to do, but also the fair thing to do.
Now, this week, of course, we saw it confirmed that inflation is now double digits in this country. It's expected to go up even further, peaking around October with 13% inflation, the highest in more than 40 years. I wonder, is there any policy that the government can pursue to reduce that level of inflation, or is this all already baked in? Is this all determined by the war in Ukraine and by the global economy stuttering back to life after all of its various lockdowns?
Well, there are a number of important factors in there. I mean, one was already actually touched on earlier by Graham Stringer, which is that the high level of inflation is at least partly a result of mistakes made by the Bank of England. And I think we need a sort of bolder policy from the Bank of England to get the monetary side of the economy back under control and to dampen inflation expectations. So it's primarily the job of the Bank of England to control inflation, not the government. The government, though, still has some role to play, partly in terms of protecting the most vulnerable people in society from the cost of living crisis. And I think there's more that the next Prime Minister should and will do on that. But also other ways as well. And, in the longer term, the government does have a role to play in keeping inflation down by improving what we call the supply side of the economy. So, boosting investment and productivity and removing some of the regulations that mean that prices are unnecessarily high. So, housing's a classic example of this because we've not built enough houses. Housing costs are an important part of the cost of living for a lot of people, and they're far higher than they need to be. So there are some things the government can do in terms of easing the burden on particular households and improving the supply side of the economy. But at the end of the day, the overall level of inflation is the responsibility of the Bank of England. And there, I think most people would agree there's a big problem.
Now, you mentioned there's more the government could and probably will do when it comes to, for example, helping people through this energy bill crisis this coming autumn and winter. And I wonder what would be the specific policies you would recommend for the government to take up in order to make sure you aren't having households going hungry this winter. The Labour Party at the start of this week had a proposal, one that would incidentally cost more than furlough did, in order to just ignore international prices, keep everything the price it is now. Number one, is that feasible? And number two, if it isn't, what should the government be doing?
Well, first of all, I understand the appeal of freezing prices at their current level. It will be, relatively simple. It will send a clear signal to consumers that the government has got your back, and it would make sure that nobody falls through the net. So I wouldn't dismiss it completely out of hand, but I still don't like the proposal for two main reasons. One is that it interferes with price signals. I mean, the bigger picture here is there's a big imbalance in the global supply and demand for energy, and higher prices are part of the solution to that. So those market signals need to be allowed to work. The second problem is that most of the benefit of freezing prices will go to people who are bigger users of energy, and they tend to be richer. So simply freezing prices is not particularly well targeted. My preferred solution is to allow prices to rise in line with what's happening globally, but to make sure that you cushion the impact on household incomes through some combination of tax cuts and benefit increases. And it's also worth remembering also that this isn't just about energy anymore. There's loads of other prices that are going up a lot, including other essentials, including food. So if you simply focus on freezing energy prices, then those people who perhaps don't have big energy bills but are struggling elsewhere in their budget won't get as much support as they would otherwise have done.
Really interesting stuff there. I suppose something that's overlooked in this conversation all the time is that these price signals really matter. When the price goes up, it encourages more suppliers to get in and produce energy, but it also encourages those that can to use less energy. Whereas if the price is just fixed, then everyone's using the same, if not more, energy, and that makes the problem potentially worse. Well, Julian Jessup, thank you for talking through those issues there. Really, really interesting stuff. Crucial indeed for people as we go into a very difficult autumn and winter. Julian Jessup there, the independent economist. Well, one of those big factors we were just discussing that is flowing in to these myriad crises that are being that are affecting not just the United Kingdom but the European Union as well, indeed America too, of course, is the war in Ukraine. That is affecting food prices, that is affecting energy prices. Let's speak now to the defence analyst Stuart Crawford, who can talk more about the state of play in this war, because there have been some signals this week that the Ukrainians may be able to turn this around, that the Russians may be able to be pushed back.
Good afternoon, Tom. Thank you for having me back on again. I think that the current state of play in Ukraine is that there hasn't been significant progress made by either side in terms of territorial gains over the past few weeks. And as has been reported extensively elsewhere, we've now settled into a sort of artillery duel stalemate with small incremental gains made by either side. The Russians in the Donbass and possibly Ukraine in the Kherson Oblast and to the south. One of the interesting aspects of what's going on now is the ability for the Ukrainians seemingly to be able to strike deep into the Russian rear areas almost at will. And the Ukrainians are playing their cards close to their chest here. They're not saying exactly what is causing these explosions in airfields and ammunition dumps in the Crimea and in the Donbass. But I reckon it's a combination of partisan guerrilla warfare, the HIMARS missile, the Arctic missiles, GPS-targeted shells, and also some accidents perhaps happening elsewhere. But the Ukrainians are not letting on because obviously they don't want the Russians to know exactly how to counter it.
It's very, very interesting to see these new weapon deliveries that came on stream in the last few weeks and months, particularly these long-range weapons being supplied by the Americans. Could they be what's making the difference here? What's making the Ukrainians feel more confident in Kherson? That's making them feel more confident, indeed, in getting right back at the Russians inside Crimea?
I don't think there's any doubt about that. They are highly accurate, more accurate than the Russian systems. The HIMARS rockets, for example, are GPS targeted, as are the Excalibur 155mm shells, which can be fired from any of the NATO supplied artillery pieces. But these pieces are still few and far between. And as Ukrainians have been saying on numerous occasions, this is the sort of stuff they want, but they need much, much more of it if there is to be any hope of a Ukrainian strategic counteroffensive towards Crimea or elsewhere, wherever they may choose to strike, before the onset of winter.
And there's one of these key flashpoints is, of course, Kherson, that city that's on the western side of the Dnieper River, that's become so symbolic of the Russians' ambitions in order to gather that port city and indeed push beyond the Dnieper River. Is it your view, as a defence analyst, that the tide could turn in Kherson, that the Ukrainians could push the Russians back to the east of the river?
I think that's a distinct possibility. You will know from coverage elsewhere that Ukrainians have been targeting the bridge crossings across the Dnieper River, with obviously Kherson, the city, on the western side, and the bulk of Russian forces on the eastern side. I think that the Ukrainians are being very careful not to attack Kherson with the full might of the artillery at their disposal, because they don't want to destroy the town. It is a city. It is a Ukrainian city after all. But there's a possibility that by cutting communications between the west and the east banks of the Dnieper River in that area, they may actually force the Russians to withdraw and leave the city for the Ukrainians to take over.
Well, Stuart Crawford, thank you so much for talking through that situation. Just as the lights go out where I'm standing here in Manchester, let's hope that the lights aren't going out in Ukraine or across Europe either this winter. Stuart Crawford, thank you so much for joining us here on The Briefing. Well, now to our final story today. Of course, the United Kingdom is not just hit by the crisis of inflation, of energy bills, of a lack of government, of plague potentially with a new WHO declared health incident. No, there's also train strikes to top it all off. Let's have a listen to what the Transport Secretary Grant Shapps had to say a little bit earlier on today.
I think the simple answer to this would be for the union bosses to actually put the deal that's on the table, which is an 8% pay rise over 2 years, no compulsory redundancies, for example, on Network Rail, and put that to their membership. And I think if they did that, the membership may well accept it. That's what's happened, actually, at a smaller union, the TSSA, who put the deal to their members. They accepted with 71% of their members, and the strike has ended, or the strike hasn't taken place. So that's all that needs to happen. If that doesn't happen, plan B, if you like, is we're going to make sure that we actually get on with these very, very important modernisations which are holding our railway back. And we'll do that through a legal process, which is called Section 188, which means that we can actually essentially impose this modernisation, which is desperately needed. But when you hear about what those conditions are, your viewers will be thinking, my goodness, are they still doing that? Sunday working, as if Sunday is as it was in 1919, the year 1919, which is what some of the contracts are still based on. So, you know, when people didn't go out travel on a Sunday, it's now a very big leisure day. Maintenance teams on Network Rail not being allowed by the unions to walk between Euston and King's Cross, 5 minutes walk, because the unions claim they're in different regions. You know, nonsense like not allowing timesheets to be filled out digitally and requiring them to be done on paper. All this kind of anachronistic stuff has got to go if we're going to run an efficient railway. And these modernisations that I think most passengers and your viewers will think, my goodness, how on earth is the railway still filling out paper timesheets? How on earth is it still rostering 2 vans, but when only one's required to do a maintenance job because the unions require you to send 2 regardless, and so on and so forth.
Transport Secretary Grant Shapps speaking a little bit earlier today, laying out some of those extraordinary working practices. Now, of course, the unions would say that they need to maintain those working practices to protect the integrity of their workforce, or even, potentially, as bargaining chips for higher pay and better conditions. Well, let's cross now to Ellie Costello. She's live for us outside Victoria Station in London. And Ellie, what's the mood on the ground here? It's not just tube strikes in London today, but rail strikes across the whole of the country this weekend. It could really create significant disruption.
Significant disruption indeed, Tom. I'm here at Victoria Station, which is being impacted by triple strike action today. There's a strike on the tube network, a strike on the London Overground, and there's also a strike on London buses in South and West London. So even though buses are running here, many of them are very full, and there is a long queue for buses here at Victoria. You might actually be able to see behind me a very long queue of people, mainly tourists, to be honest with you. It does seem from the people that I've been speaking to today, Tom, that it isn't really commuters being affected by this. It is a Friday. Many of them have been able to work from home. It is tourists who have come to London, have arrived at Victoria with big suitcases, and they now can't make their way around the capital city. I did speak to a lady earlier who'd been stood in the taxi queue behind me, a very large queue, for almost 50 minutes, and she was very frustrated. This is because 10,000 tube workers are expected to have walked out today, 400 overground workers as well. It's a strike over pay, jobs and conditions. It's actually the 5th time the RMT members on the London Underground have walked out so far this year. And speaking this morning, the General Secretary of the RMT, Mick Lynch, he claimed that there was a big stalemate in the talks between the Mayor of London's office and the government, that is TfL and the government. He says that the unions haven't even been allowed in those discussions, in those meeting rooms, and they say they're very upset that they haven't been able to see TfL's funding plan. They want to see assurances for jobs. They want to know that people aren't going to lose their jobs. Meanwhile, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, as we've just heard, he's argued that the rail industry has made a very good and fair offer. The Department of Transport saying that they want the unionists off the picket line and around the meeting table and essentially back to work. So that is the rhetoric that is going on in the background of this strike action that's taking place today. But of course, Tom, there's also that separate bus action, the bus strike taking place in South and West London. That's affecting 60 routes. Again, over pay. Over 1,000 bus drivers have walked out today saying that a 3.6% pay rise this year and a 4.2% pay rise next year. They say it's not in line with inflation and therefore they are taking a real terms pay cut. So it does mean that on the ground there is very little tube service. There's virtually no train service on the overground around London, and in the south and west of the city you are going to struggle to get a bus as well. So we know that the roads are busy. You can see behind me they're busy. The data is up 40% today based on the same day last week, so it is going to take you 40% longer to make journeys around London. But Tom, the advice today is to check before you travel and leave plenty of time if you are making your way around London today.
Well, Ellie Costello, thank you so much for bringing us that news. It's a bit depressing given that they're seeking the sort of pay rises that I don't think any industry is being given at this point in time. We'll have to follow this one closely. Well, that's it for the programme from me today. Tune in again at 3 p.m. for your next political briefing here on GB News. And of course, from 7 p.m. till 9 p.m, the latest Conservative hustings. Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, live on GB News and only on GB News. But before then, here's your weather.
Hi there. A bright day for many. Sunny spells expected, especially in the south, but there will be showers and a keen breeze, especially in the north. And that's because an area of low pressure is slow moving near Iceland, and tightly packed isobars to the south of that low is bringing, well, fairly breezy conditions to the northern half of the UK. Quite a number of showers. There were some showers earlier in the day across the rest of England and Wales. They're now moving and clearing the far southeast by shortly after 1 or 2 p.m. Once they clear, it'll be a bright afternoon for much of England and Wales, some sunshine, 1 or 2 showers for North Wales, North West England, but the bulk of the showers, along with a keen breeze, will be for Scotland and Northern Ireland. Temperatures not straying far from average, low 20s for many, 24, 25 Celsius in the southeast. Many showers disappear in the evening, with clear spells breaking out fairly widely for a time before the cloud thickens. Outbreaks of heavy and blustery rain come into the west of Scotland and Northern Ireland, a strengthening breeze. 11 to 12 Celsius for much of Scotland and Northern Ireland. Mid-teens more likely for parts of England and Wales, although in some sheltered spots a fresh start to Saturday. A bright start for the Midlands, East Anglia and the southeast. We keep these sunny spells here into the afternoon. Otherwise, a lot of cloud and heavy rain moving through Scotland and Northern Ireland, pushing into parts of northern England, turning more showery. And it's a breezy day for many. That wind gusty around the showers that will be coming